Welcome to Philosophy Slam, the podcast, with myself, Mark Vernon, and my slamming collaborator, Robert Rowland Smith. Hi there, Robert.
Hello, co-slammer.
We get together, and originally this began in person, Philosophy Slam, where we would be with a live audience, different settings, maybe a comedy club, maybe a private members club, maybe a corporate situation, and people would throw out words and we riff, drawing on psychology and literature and philosophy and all that we can muster to illuminate this rich thing that we call words. But we decided to go for a podcast too, and so hence Philosophy Slam, the podcast, where we take two words that have come to us one way or another, and then see about the resonances often, or the not, and find out that takes us in a wonderful direction as well, unpacking these things. So, Robert, today we've gone for one option which we use, which is to return to a random word producer, which there are many on the internet. And you just did that and came up with two for us.
I did. Let me introduce those. And yes, just to say, as well as our podcast, we do still do these live events. In fact, we're recording this on a day where we're meeting again this evening at the Union Club in Soho, which is one of our more regular haunts. And I think one of the pleasures of Philosophy Slam for us is that although the words are different every time, we seem to be building up a bit of a community of people who return. Because, of course, it's not like going to a play twice because you never quite know what's going to appear. It's more like going to a football match where you never know the result. And I say that, by the way. I mean, one of the many differences between us, Mark, is I'm a very keen football fan. And I read the autobiography of Arsene Wenger when it came out a few years ago. And he confessed in his autobiography he's very boring and he never does anything apart from go to football. And somebody said, well, don't you like go to you're French, don't you like going to the theatre or what? He says, no, because you know the ending and it's the same ending no matter how many times you go. Whereas a football match, you just never know. So anyway, that's my little...
Even someone with the genius of Arsene Wenger can never predict the outcome.
Even him, yes, exactly. But yes, I came up with two words for us to riff on, dissect, analyze, and so on. So our two words for today are danger, which is interesting because you'd been talking about the notion of safety just before when we were chatting. So as if maybe the AI had overheard us and offered us an antonym. But anyway, word one, danger. Word number two, something that possibly is connected, possibly not, reinforce. So we've got danger and reinforce, and we're going to try and say something about those two words. One's a noun, one's a verb. And do you want to kick us off, Mark?
Yeah, okay. Well, since I was thinking about safety and safe and safeguarding, in fact, danger, I believe, is resonant in that respect because I understand that it comes from old French words and indeed Latin words that actually refer to lordship and the exercise of power. It's like the Latin dominus, lord. And apparently danger is an old French word for really what we would say now is the abuse of power, but lording it over. And so that D is the kind of clue. And I like that because it says that danger carries the felt quality of being active. And I think that's important, actually, because when we feel something's dangerous, it's like we might be taken, we might be overwhelmed, we might be removed or threatened by something, a power that's greater than us. And so it does have that kind of active quality. Real danger is not something that if you think through, you can work your way around it as if, we're the ones with the intelligence and the cognition and that we can therefore make something safe, the danger subsiding. Real danger is when you can't quite approach it in that way. And therefore the sense of threat is always real and remains with you. I mean, maybe it's a bit like Arsene Wenger and the football outcome that you can do all the work you like, but you still can't pin it down because there's more variables than you can account for. And indeed, there's the active participation of the other side. I don't know whether I'm stretching into the world of football too much there, but nonetheless, danger having this kind of active quality. And I think that this links back to what I was thinking about safety and safeguarding, because I think good safeguarding is not about a checkbox activity. Have we done this? Have we put that policy in place? Do we allow this and not allow something else? As if a sort of set of inert rules can really bring about safeguarding. Really good safeguarding has got to be about understanding the situation, facilitating people to enter a particular domain, and equipping them to be able to engage, to prepare themselves, to know how they respond in certain situations. And so in a way, giving the power in safeguarding to the participant, rather than assuming that those who are running something or those who are overseeing something can control all the variables and therefore make the situation safe. You clearly do that as much as you can, but having a kind of alternative empowerment when you're entering a situation of danger seems to be kind of rattling around in the spirit of the word. Yeah, I wonder whether that makes some sort of sense to you.
It does, yes. And I like your phrase alternative empowerment as well. I'm going to try and connect already reinforcement to this notion of danger. And first of all, in a completely literal way, actually, my neighbours the other day were saying they've just come back from France, lovely summer holiday, and next year they want to go to Carcassonne. And it made me think Carcassonne is a famous walled city, medieval walled city in the southwest of France. Beautifully preserved, actually. It's wonderful to visit. But of course, there's a direct link there between danger and reinforcement, because you're literally reinforcing the walls of a city against danger. So although we got these words off the random word generator on the internet, they are very, very sort of tightly connected in a physical sense. The other connections I wanted to make actually were in relation to two thinkers, psychologists, philosophers. Maybe I'll do one now and save the other for later. The first one is Bert Hellinger, whom you know, Mark, as a thinker of systemic philosophy and a practitioner of family constellations. And the other is Michel Foucault, because I think there's some connections here. So the first thing I want to say, Bert Hellinger asks this question: what is the most fundamental instinct in human beings? Now, Freud had a go at that by saying it is pleasure. That's the most fundamental instinct. We want to fulfill our wishes. Before Freud, you might have said Nietzsche, what's our most fundamental instinct? Power, possibly, you could say in Nietzsche. It's quite an interesting question. In Hellinger, the answer is belonging. And my most fundamental instinct is to belong. But I've been thinking about that, and I've been thinking that belonging is actually only a proxy for safety. The reason we want to belong to a family, to a group of friends, to a society, to an institution, is because of the benefit that belonging brings. And the chief benefit that belonging brings is safety, because when I belong, I'm among others, I am reinforced, to use that word, and therefore I'm less in danger than I might otherwise be. So it seems to me that safety, as the aversion of danger, might be an even more primary instinct than belonging, or even pleasure for that matter, in Freud, and even power for that matter in Nietzsche. Of course, this is all speculation. How do we know really how to calibrate the human soul? And it sounds quite evolutionary to say we are calibrated to avoid danger as our most fundamental instinct, as if we are still on the savannah or in the jungle or something. But nevertheless, I think that's quite for me, an important way of understanding what we mean by belonging. Belonging as a means of safety, as the aversion of danger. And then having done that, we seek to reinforce our belonging through behaviors that tell other people in our belonging group that we comply and conform with those standards. So we might dress in the same way, hold the same political views, go to the same places, and so on. So I thought I'd put that in as maybe a first link between danger and reinforcement.
I like that. And it also reminds me of another word that is really key in Bert Hellinger's work, which is the word love. And I think that you can read maybe what you're saying as, well, sometimes it's said that the opposite of fear, say, is not actually peace or even security, but is love. And again, because love has that dynamic kind of quality. And so I'm wondering whether the instinct around danger, maybe it's the flip side of also the instinct around love. The two actually are much more closely connected, because I think that the thing that really brings people peace, in a world that does throw up dangers, that's absolutely fundamental. We can half persuade ourselves in the modern world that there aren't real dangers that we can't overcome, but really, you only have to have some sort of have a disastrous, disease or condition sort of overtake you, come in from the sidelines, and you realise that was a sort of fantasy, really. But what still I think can help in such situations is the notion of being loved and of loving, in spiritual traditions, but also personally. If you have something that is really a threat in your life, that really is dangerous, at least sometimes, momentarily even, relief is found not really by having the danger lessened, because you can know it might return, but is by knowing there's something sort of bigger than the danger. And that word love captures something of that, I think. In Hellinger's work, of course, love too is a multi-faceted, that love can lead people to danger. The sense that someone might belittle their own life in order to remember something horrendous that happened elsewhere in the family system, as it's put. That's a kind of love, but it's a sacrificial love, but in the kind of dark sense often too. So I like that sense of danger, and then how you're relating it to these other things like power or belonging and so on. It feels like it has, again, a kind of lived quality, not just a more transactional quality like power does. Who's got the greater power, or who can assert their power, or something like that. This more connected sense that you're bringing in, I think, is really valuable, actually.
Well, let me pick up on that word power and loop back to Michel Foucault, who I mentioned, because I was thinking, particularly with the word reinforce, of the famous work by Foucault, which gets translated as discipline and punish, surveiller et punir, which is more like surveillance and punishment. But anyway, one of the things he says, he talks about the institution of the prison. And of course, in a prison, danger and reinforcing are both sort of important aspects of what goes on. So danger relates to the prison because, in principle, the inmates are people who are a danger to society and therefore need to be kept away from society. But then prisons themselves are notorious for being dangerous in and of themselves, because the prisoners might become a danger to each other. And because of that possibility, the prison, through principally a series of rules, will seek to reinforce certain behaviours, particularly non-violence, of course, but other behaviours which, for Foucault, are most manifest or best represented perhaps in the notion of the timetable, because a timetable has a function which is essentially to organise individuals, put them within a, yes, safe, non-dangerous structure, but in order to essentially disempower, use the word empowering earlier, but it's a disempowering process to give somebody a timetable, because essentially you're giving them a series of rules to obey and to comply with. Foucault famously refers back to Jeremy Bentham's notion of the panopticon, which is a sort of watchtower in the centre of an institution that keeps an eye on everybody within it and makes sure that all activity is visible. A concept really expanded by George Orwell in 1984 with the notion of Big Brother, who is seeing not only the visible but the invisible. Big Brother's aspiration, and perhaps an aspiration he succeeds in, is seeing inside people's minds. So you can have thought crime, for example, when people are breaking the rules that had been reinforced in that society. And essentially what Foucault goes on to say is that, and he's very influenced here, by the way, by a Marxist thinker called Louis Althusser, who says, actually, although we think of a prison as an unusual or exceptional or very different form of social institution, particularly in terms of danger and reinforcing things, actually it's very like how schools work, and hospitals and other institutions, the point of which is to produce what Foucault calls docile subjects. So the state is always best enabled or supported if it has citizens who are essentially apathetic, who won't become forces of dissent or resistance in some way. So the reinforcement of things like timetables at schools or in hospitals and in prisons serve an ideological purpose, essentially, and their potential danger, political danger, is therefore neutralized.
That's very fascinating. I mean, I read quite a lot of Foucault at a particular point as well, and again, for me, part of his genius is that he was able to get to the kind of inner story of these external features of our modern lives and understand how it affects us. And I know I was reading actually fairly recently an account of a great medieval movement called the Brethren of the Free Spirit, that was this kind of apocalyptic, messianic, very eclectic set of different figures and movements. I mean, at the one end, even figures like St. Francis of Assisi have been linked to it, figures like Teresa of Avila and others. But then there are now very obscure figures that actually thought they were kind of Christ returning in order to respond to what seemed like very, very risky, dangerous, overwhelming times, the collapse of the feudal system, the disturbance in society, great wars, and the Brethren of the Free Spirit were kind of a reaction to that. But what is so fascinating, given what you're just saying there, when you read these stories of the medieval period, is that there was just so much less ability to reinforce social norms at the time. I think we're quite inclined to think of the medieval world as one of conformity, of a sort of monolithic kind of culture. But there just practically wasn't the technology in order to reach across a continent, like Europe, even a region, within that continent. And the technology, such as timetables, you didn't have the regularization of time to produce the timetable. And so whilst I think this produced a kind of freedom that nowadays we might actually feel was really dangerous, how can you pin it down? All sorts of things might pop up in all sorts of ways, disturbance and, apocalyptic leaders and so on. It reminded me of how perhaps the danger from the kind of collapse of these reinforcing practices in the modern world, we kind of don't quite believe the story behind that exercise of power anymore. It feels again like there's bigger forces than we really can control, and therefore we should respond to in docile terms, like the climate changing, for example, or like the movement to a bipolar world, and these other sort of deep seismic shifts, that the old technologies that were used to make us docile and trading, therefore, a kind of promise of safety in the face of danger, the reinforcement of ourselves that perhaps we recognize it's sort of to the detriment of ourselves, but at least it keeps us safe. That kind of transaction, covenant even, I don't think it's breaking down, actually. We still live in very sort of safe worlds compared to the medieval period. But nonetheless, there's a sense of it being stress tested. And is this old deal around danger and reinforcement gonna work?
Fantastic, Mark. And, you brought us right up to date there. Feels like we should probably leave it at that for now, because we're in danger of going on too long. And of course, we need to reinforce our reputation as good timekeepers here. So let's bring danger and reinforce to a close for now. But thanks very much for the conversation, Mark. Good to see you, hear you. And just to remind people, if you're listening, do follow us on our YouTube channel, as you'll be doing, liking, subscribing, sharing, and so on. You can follow Mark on his various social medias. You must buy his new book, which may not be new by the time you're listening to this, but is amazing nevertheless. It's called William Blake and the Power of the Imagination. Highly recommended. And what else? Yes, if you want to come along to an in-person event, where we generally do them in London, but sometimes in the countryside around the UK, you're very welcome. And if anybody out there wants to book us for an extremely well-paid corporate gig, well, we couldn't politely refuse such a thing as that. So thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye for now.
Bye for now.